It was, of course, boys' names they were looking for. By now, not only the dispatcher from Manchester, who had given homes to Max and Percy, had sexed a kitten, the little cat had suffered the indignity of having several colleagues examining his nether regions, patting at his mass of fur down below and nodding sagely as they said, "Definitely a boy." Gareth, continuing his tradition of silly ideas, suggested David Hasselhoff or Mr. T as suitable names. Others were more traditional, Socks or celebrity-inspired Keith after Keith Lemon. Dave Rooney, one of the team leaders with whom the cat was growing particularly close, suggested the very creative Aloysius. "Aloysius," said Angie indignantly. "What kind of name is that?" She glared at Dave. "Please don't let them pick that." But Angie would have no control over it. None of the TPE team would. The draw would be made at random, and to ensure it was fair and neutral, they had asked John, a driver-manager from another company, to make the selection. Whatever name he pulled out would be the one. It was a non-negotiable outcome. The stakes were high indeed. As Tuesday the 19th of July drew closer, the cardboard box storing all the entries grew fuller. Each name was written on a scrap of paper, and once the entrants had paid their 50p, the scrap of paper got thrown in the box. A close eye was kept on it to ensure there was no cheating, much as Angie might have wished she could throw away some of those names, like another suggestion proposed by someone with a black sense of humour. Splat. Splat for a railway cat. Who'd be out on the tracks? It was hardly appropriate. Jean suggested Frafty, which had been the name of her children's cat when they were growing up. The station kitten was a spitting image of that much-loved family pet. It was perhaps Terry on the barriers who nailed it, though, when he scribbled 4 letters on his scrap of paper. His suggestion read, Boss. Rachel Stockton, a conductor who'd once worked for the RSPCA, had a real liking for a certain cartoon cat. When she first laid eyes on the station kitten, she said to herself, "He's a right little Felix." And that's the name she popped into the all-important cardboard box. The draw was made at about 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 19th of July 2011. Angie was there. To make sure it was absolutely neutral, she was nowhere near the box as John picked it up and another assistant stood nearby. It was like the lottery draw, with independent adjudicators. The kitten, utterly oblivious, prowled around the office, little knowing that the tall man with wispy grey hair standing above him was about to pluck his name from a forest of potentials. John was a gruff, fair-minded, no-nonsense kind of man. He was used to dealing firmly with hard-nosed drivers on a day-to-day basis, and everything about him said, "Don't mess with me." Nobody would be debating the outcome of the draw, that was for sure. He pushed his hand into the box, swirled it through the scraps of paper. Angie watched him. Her heart in her hand settled on one and plucked it out. "Felix," he announced commandingly. Felix. It fitted everything about him, Angie thought. It was short, it was nice, it wasn't Aloysius. Gareth Hope was a bit disappointed, however. "There's probably 1,000,000 cats in the UK called Felix," he grumbled. "I wanted something unique." As for Rachel, when she heard the news, she pumped her fist into the air and cried, "Yes! Felix was a top name for a cat, and it did suit that little piebald kitten to a T." Angie bent down to the kitten and scooped him up. "Morning, Felix," she said. He looked at her nonplussed. "Morning, gorgeous," she added. Some habits die hard. Right, chapter 7, Felix works his magic. The kitten had been at the station for almost a week now, and the transformation in morale was astonishing. Huddersfield had always had a family feel, but just as with actual relatives, along with the closeness of that familiar atmosphere could come the odd row or niggle as people rubbed along with each other. But getting a cat had seemed to bring everyone together. Morale was at an all-time high. When the Head of Steam, the pub at the northern end of Platform 1, had its jazz night on a Wednesday, the team was seen literally dancing, sucked everyone in and bowled them over. No one seemed untouched by his magic. Angie Hunt, to her great surprise, even walked in on Billy playing with the kitten one day when he thought nobody was watching. You could feed computer wires to reach a plug. There was one such unused hole in Billy's desk, and she'd found him dabbling his fingers through it as Felix followed their movements from the floor, completely transfixed by the wiggling digits. "All right, Billy," she'd greeted him in her honeyed Yorkshire burr. He'd coughed, that gruff smoker's cough caused by his frequent cigarellos. "All right, Mrs. H," he replied. He'd surveyed the cat sitting on the floor, who was by now washing himself with his rough pink tongue, making his black fur even more fluffy. "My," Billy commented aloud, nodding his head, "he's a grand-looking lad." Angie had smiled to herself. "Yes, he is, Billy," was all she'd said. Angie herself thought the reality of having a cat was just heavenly. She and Felix grew closer by the day. If Angie was sitting at her desk working, Felix would come up to her and climb up on her lap. Then, after a while, he'd reach up his paws towards her shoulders. She'd look down at his little face, gazing into hers, and say, "Come on then." And Felix would climb up and sit on her shoulder, draping himself across her like a warm, fluffy scarf. And there he would remain while she tapped away at the keyboard. Felix, as it turned out, was a big fan of cuddles. When Andy Crugan was on nights, which were always a quieter time with just 2 team members on shift, he found Felix would latch onto him and follow him around. When he sat to do the accounting, the kitten would sit on his lap or find a crease in his arm and go to sleep. And his own cat, Missy, a tabby tortoiseshell mix, was friendly enough, but she would never ever sit on his knee. The first time Felix snuggled up to him, he found himself feeling quite touched. And then, of course, every time he sat down, the kitten wanted a cuddle, and it became rather like having a demanding 3-year-old on his hands. Somehow, though, he found he didn't seem to mind too much. Felix, when awake, was always more than willing to lend a hand with the cashing up. He was a member of the team, after all, but the lively kitten did not differentiate between work and play. They were one and the same to him. Andy would be cashing up and Felix would keep putting a paw on the cash, almost as if the cat was claiming a high-stakes gambling prize. Or Felix might park his bottom on the cash, or lounge across the balance sheet, or chase a dropped note halfway across the office. Sometimes, just at the moment when Andy had very nearly totted everything up and the neat stacks of money were in ordered, counted piles, Felix would get spooked by a noise from outside, and off the kitten would dart. Right through all those piles of money, there would be cash everywhere. Gareth, too, found Felix rather a hindrance when it came to doing his job. As the kitten did with Angie, Felix liked to use Gareth as a climbing frame, first to his lap, and then a scramble up his chest to his shoulder. Sometimes he'd lie lengthways across Gareth's back, so that the announcer could move neither forwards nor backwards, but would have to stay frozen in that position until the kitten decided to wake up. At other times, Felix would make the daring final step on his ascent from Gareth's shoulder to his head. It became a new favoured location for a snooze. He'd clamber all the way up there, then curl up, tail to nose, somehow perfectly balanced on Gareth's skull, and fall fast asleep. If a customer came to the window when the cat was in that position, however, Gareth regrettably felt the kitten was in far too precarious a pose for him to move. "I can't come to you, I'm afraid," he would call out to the customer in a helpfulest tone as he could muster. "You'll have to shout." The customers never seemed to mind, though. In fact, most were totally charmed by this adorable new arrival and wanted to know the full story about how and why he was there. Nonetheless, Felix was rarely seen by anyone other than the team in those early weeks, as he spent most of his time very much behind the scenes, and much of that asleep. Cats are reckoned to slumber for an average of 14 hours a day, and Felix was, in this regard at least, a typical moggy. However, he never seemed to fancy dozing in the cosy bed the team had prepared for him. Instead, as well as on Gareth's head or in the crook of Andy's arm, Felix would bed down in all sorts of places, across keyboards, in trays, in the staff shower room, or on the seat of an office chair. Once he foolishly chose a wall-mounted letter rack to nod off in. As he awoke and adjusted his weight, the letter rack wobbled unsteadily on the wall. Never had a cat dismounted a letter rack quite so fast. For all the hours he spent asleep, though, there was still plenty of time for fun. Felix was full of life, and every part of the office held possibilities. If Gareth did take him to the window, which was a traditional serving hatch, Felix loved to dabble his paws in a dip in the desk, through which customers might pass money and the team return tickets. Even as a tiny kitten, he wasn't quite small enough to get all the way to the other side, but he would have a good old go. He could get his head in the bucket bit and one white cat paw out on the other side, but could go no further than that. He used to run riot in the office, always watched hawkishly by a member of the team, of course. Gareth tried to get him involved in the station announcements, but Felix merely sniffed at the microphone in confusion, and not a single amplified meow was bestowed upon the waiting customers. Balls of paper were a delight to him, while the pens on a string that were attached to the signing-in clipboards were almost as good as the mice on a string he'd been used to playing with at the Briscoes' house. Fun as all this was, however, and expecting his cuddly brown bear, which was a different kind of toy, as Felix approached the end of his first week, his playthings tended to be brilliant improvised office accoutrements, not cat-specific objects. But all that was about to change. Angie happened to be in the office when it happened. She was checking something, so she didn't take in what was going on at first. Martin was on duty, and she remembered him saying when Felix had first arrived, "You can't sit there," and moving the cat from the workspace. Martin clearly didn't do cats, and that was fine, each to their own. "Come on then," the announcer was saying now. "Come on then." Out of the corner of her eye, Angie glimpsed Felix leaping up onto the desk. He pottered around, then sat down on the keyboard. Less than a week ago, Martin would have told him, "You can't sit there," but it seemed Felix had made a new friend. As Angie watched, Martin slid open his desk drawer and pulled out a little gift for Felix. It was a small brown mouse on a red pull string. It was the first toy the station cat was ever given by a colleague. And it was Martin, a quiet man who kept himself to himself, who had given it to him. Angie was amazed to see the transformation in her colleague. Felix had connected with Martin, as the cat was doing with so many of the team. He'd brought so many people down to human where nobody else could get through to them, Angie revealed. Someone who's just out on their own and they've got their blinkers on. That cat can turn somebody like that. He's changed a lot of characters. But the question remained, would he be able to change the most important character of all, the one who held the power over whether he could stay? For Paul's secondment was over. The boss was back. Gareth had never felt so nervous in his life. The first morning back at work with Paul in place again as the station manager, he felt as if he was walking on eggshells. He crept into the office, and there was a little ball of fluff to greet him. "Morning, Felix," he said, wondering how many more mornings were left to him and his cat. At least the kitten hadn't been banished outright on Paul's return. As was now their routine, Felix leapt onto his lap, curled up, and went to sleep. And that was how Paul found them when he walked into the announcer's office later that same shift. Gareth hadn't told him they were getting the cat. He was far too terrified to take on that particular shoot the messenger role, so someone else must have dropped the bombshell. Paul let the door close softly behind him. He took in the sight of the young announcer with the black and white cat on his knees. Up went the eyebrows. Then Paul gave a slight, almost amused shake of his head, smiled wryly, and didn't say a thing. Felix was here to stay. Chapter 8, New Discoveries. It took perhaps a day for Paul to warm to the cat. By the second day, like Billy and Martin before him, he was playing with the kitten as happily as the rest of his team. And it was Paul, together with Angie Hunt, who took the lead on Felix's next big move, the feline's first trip to the vets. Felix was clearly a very clever cat, yet he had had his moments of foolishness. With his position at the station only just secured and caring not a jot for the company hierarchy, when Paul tried to place him gently into the cat carrier, Felix fought back. Swipe! 3 bramble scratches appeared on the station manager's nose. Way to go to endear yourself to the boss, Felix. Yet Felix clearly remembered all too well the scary journey on his way to Huddersfield Station. Even though his own personal carrier was a different model from the one he'd been transported in by the Briscoes, this time with a sky blue bottom and an oatmeal-coloured top, when he saw the ominous-looking carry case sitting on the desk, so obviously waiting for him with its yawning plastic mouth, he twigged what was going on and became a wild cat. His mood didn't improve when, after Paul and Angie had wrestled him in and driven him off in the car, they arrived at the vets. Animals, perhaps understandably, never liked going to a vet. Even though it was Felix's first time, he was already angsty from being put in the carrier, and to wait in the lobby with all the other animals was very disconcerting. The kitten was here to get a general checkup and his first inoculation jab. The vet's careful hands held the tiny little cat, who looked up at him through narrowed eyes grumpily. Then Felix, to his intense annoyance, was once more turned upside down in the most undignified manner, and his nether regions probed. "Ah," announced the vet knowingly, "you've got a little girl." Paul and Angie looked at each other in astonishment. They were stunned. But as Felix was turned upright and placed back down on the metal table, she washed herself indignantly without a hint of shock. "Yes," she seemed to be saying, "get with the programme, humans. I'm a lady." The reaction to the news at the station was massive. It caused both a few chuckles and a few dropped jaws. How could this have happened? Then the next big question arose. Should they change Felix's name? The outcome of the charity draw was supposed to be non-negotiable, but was it fair to give a female cat a name that had been intended for a boy? Would Felicity not be more apt? All sorts of suggestions were bandied around. But in the end, Felix stuck. It suited her. A girl cat with a name like Felix seemed a bit different, a bit spirited, and that was certainly the character of the Huddersfield Station cat. In time, she grew to recognise her name and would even come when called, if she was in the right frame of mind. She seemed pretty happy with it. In fact, she seemed pretty happy with her lot generally. And why wouldn't she be, when she was getting spoilt rotten? Every day was play day. As the next few weeks passed, she had an absolute riot in the offices of Huddersfield Station. Martin's toy had only been the start of it. Team leader Dave Rooney got her first laser toy, and she loved that, especially on a night shift when it was dark and the laser light so bright. "Felix, what's that?" the team would say as they switched it on. "What's that?" And she'd look, and they'd turn it off. "Where's it gone? Where's it gone? On! There it is! Go, Felix, go!" And she'd sprint after the maddening light. She continued her usual games of sleeping or lying on anything that stayed still for longer than 30 seconds too. Often, she'd spread eagle herself across the official objects so authoritatively that to all intents and purposes, she looked as though she was helping the team with their duties. But nothing could be further from the truth. Whatever Felix's intentions, for example, one of these reclining hotspots was where the conductors kept their cash bags, which might be piled one on top of another. The conductors would be lining up, rushing to get off on a service, but before they went, they had to take hold of the very item the cat was stretched out upon so comfortably. In the end, they became adept at performing that old magician's tablecloth trick, pulling them out from under her as she watched proceedings like a hawk, as though looking for the secret of how they did it. As Felix settled in, Angie and the rest of the team got to grips with how paying for Felix worked. Essentially, the company covered all costs, but they had to be attributed to something on the disbursement paperwork, an explanation given as to why the money was being spent. Angie chewed the end of her pen as she sat facing her first form to cover Felix's food costs. What to put? A smile crossed her face as she scribbled it down. Pest controller needs nourishment. After that, they often referred to Felix as the pest controller. But perhaps another nickname would have been more apt, the destroyer. For although Felix had a scratching post, she preferred to rake her claws along the office chairs or the fabric notice boards or her colleagues' clothes and hands. She was growing larger and bolder by the day and had now learned to combine two of her favourite games, the climbing frame athletics extravaganza she preferred with Gareth, and the old school trouser tango with which she'd used to terrorise her grandfather, Chris Briscoe. A colleague would be walking along, minding their own business, when Felix would suddenly launch herself at them and run up their back. They'd feel the telltale twinge of cat claw, and then the full weight of the kitten as she anchored herself to their work trousers. Then she'd be up, and away, dragging her claws through the fabric as she ascended their legs, moving on to the slippery smooth surface of a work shirt, giving a trampoline-like push up onto the shoulder, and then the piece de resistance as she reached the summit, claiming the head. Her claws were such that it rather felt like being skewered with a flag reading Felix when she reached the top. She tried this trick with lots of people, but unsurprisingly, not many of the team enjoyed the sensation of a cat using them for mountaineering practice. So it was only a hardy few like Gareth whom she used consistently for her energetic climbs. The team's trousers were in a right state, full of tiny holes and pulls in them, for where she'd at least tried to run up their legs before being lifted off. It was clear to everyone that Felix was going a little stir crazy. And that's where I'm going to leave it today.